We're going to be doing Brachot, Daf Yud Gimel, top 10 teachings. The first of the teachings is, what is the difference between Yacov and Yisroel, between why after God gave first the angel that wrestled with Jacob and gave him and told him, you will no longer be called, you'll be called Israel and no longer Jacob, and God confirms that himself later. Why do we still find that Jacob is referred to sometimes as Yisroel, and other times as Jacob? While in contrast to other people who are renamed, such as Abraham and Sarah, who are originally Avraham, he's missing the hey, or Sarai, where once their names are changed, they're no longer referred to, with only very rare exception that has a specific reason. Perhaps when it's being referencing their earlier state, do we refer to them with their original name? Otherwise, their new name is considered the only name, and it's actually a prohibition to refer to them in their earlier name. So why is that? So the simple answer is that in the case of Abraham and Sarah, their new names supersede their previous names. And in the case of Jacob and Israel, both their names represent an aspect that continues to flourish. And what is the different aspects between the name Jacob and Israel? So a number of commentaries have different explanations. One could be brought down by Rav Hirsch, but referencing earlier commentaries as well, that Jacob represents the state of the struggle, because the name is when he's kind of in this inferior state of struggling, and Israel is a reference to his kind of superiority when he's on the top. And even though he is renamed Israel, since there are times where he will continue to struggle, so for example, when he's in a state of mourning for the loss of his son Joseph, who he thinks is dead, that sadness could bring him back to the state of Jacob. There's a lot of stuff on this in Kabbalah and Chassidut. That's not really something we have to get into in terms of the Talmud, other than acknowledging that this concept is in the Talmud of this kind of differences in why Jacob and Israel continued to be used for him. Another answer brought down by the Mishal Chachma is that Jacob represents the individual Jacob, and Israel, which is now how the people of Israel are referred to, is a reference to the collective. So when Israel, even though he's also a person, is referred to as Yisroel, it's because for some reason in that context, there's some national element to the meaning of why he's being spoken to by God. And as I said, there are many other answers, but that is just two of the many explanations of why Jacob and Israel continue to be used while we don't use both names for Abraham. Okay. Number two is the Gemara tells us the following, that part of the problem that we face is that we have so many hardships that we tend to forget the later hardships, the earlier hardships, because they're replaced by more current events, more recent tragedies. And the Gemara says, for example, let me show that to you. Rabbi Yosef taught, referencing a verse, that he said, Zehu Melchamat Gog u'Magog. This refers to the war against Gog u'Magog. And he explains, Mashal Mahadavar Doma, an analogy. La'adam Shaya Mahalach Baderech, a person is traveling, he encounters a wolf, but then he is saved from the wolf. And he would tell people about this great thing about this story about how he was saved. This time he encounters a lion, which is scarier than a wolf, and he's saved from that as well. He was talking about, wow, this amazing story about how he was saved from a lion. Then he encountered a snake, which in a sense is worse than any of the earlier two, and he was saved from that. He totally forgot the two earlier stories. And he recounted the story of the snake. So to Israel, the latter hardships make us forget the earlier difficulties. Okay, let's talk about Gog umagog for a moment. There's a beautiful kedusha Levi that explains the following, that the Gemara says that many of these holidays will be forgotten, meaning they'll be insignificant, but the story of Purim will not be forgotten. So Reb Levi Yitzchak Berditchev explains that similar to the Gemara mentioning that Gog umagog is like the thing that will ultimately be the story that we talk about, because it'll be such a tremendous salvation from a terrible calamity. So too Purim is connected to Gog umagog. Many commentaries understand that Gog umagog is an extension of Amalek, and we also understand in the story of Purim that Haman ben Hamdasa Ha'agagi, the Agagite, was actually an Amalekite, and therefore being saved on Purim is something that we'll never forget. Now, why is that? So, in the Pachad Yitzchak, Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner, in a beautiful mashal, explains the following. It's called the story of the night watchman. And the story is as follows. This is an amazing story. One time, there was a little village that couldn't afford lighting, and it couldn't afford a proper way of safeguarding the village with walls and moats like other stronger, bigger, wealthier towns were able to do. And all they had was a night watchman. And the night watchman didn't have light. He didn't have a moat to open and close. All he had was his wits. So what he would do is he would listen in the dark, because it was dark. And if he would hear anything, if he heard anything from a distance, he heard a crunch of the leaves, if he heard birds flying, he understood that somebody was there, and he would call out, "Who goes there?" And the person would identify themselves. But he made sure that not only did he listen to the person's name, but also to their voice, and whether or not they sounded scared, and whether or not they were coming alone, to the extent that he became such a good night watchman that he was able to identify things that 99% of people couldn't figure out, because he listened so intently, because he had no resources. It was such a poor village. He made up with his lack of resources, with his wisdom that he learned how to understand what was really happening in the world. He created his own intelligence. He was like his own FBI, and figured out what was happening, and therefore eventually he got a promotion because he was considered so amazing that he possibly got a much better position in a much bigger city to run a much bigger team of intelligence, let's say. And until the last day, he always credited his earlier way of being able to evaluate a situation, because he started out in this poor town with no resources and had to compensate with that lack of resources with his way of listening very intently and learning what he learned. So too, the Pachad Yitzchak, Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner says, the story of Purim is that same story. It's the story of the night watchman. It's the story of us from so little learning so much. And even when we'll have resources, even when the Mashiach will come, what we have learned in exile, particularly in the story of Purim, will stay with us. Those are lessons that we'll hold on to forever. So that might be that amplifies that statement that the Kedusha Levi explains in the Gemara and Brachos here, that one of the holidays that will not be forgotten is Purim. I might also add that even though it's not a holiday, although there is a day of remembrance, Yom HaShoah, but it's definitely not a holiday, we do remember the Holocaust and the victims of the Holocaust, the 6 million. But many authorities hold that Hitler was actually from Amalek. So in that sense, many people argue that World War II already was the war of Gog and Magog, which did get resolved and ultimately led to the founding of the State of Israel, because the UN must have had a moment of compassion on the beleaguered Jews who remained after the Holocaust, when just a few years later they accepted the proposal to have, I guess it was the partition plan at that point, to have a state of Israel. So that's something that we could say that perhaps is relevant. Obviously, different rabbis interpret world events differently, and I'm one that's very likely to not really try to understand world events in the context of what the prophets talked about, because it's too easily misunderstood. But I thought I would share that with you. Now we're on to number 2. We're going to go to number 3, which is about the Abrahamic religions. A lot of people today, I have friends who are involved in this idea of the Abrahamic religions. What is the Abrahamic religions? The simple meaning of the Abrahamic religions is simply that, at the very least, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all share in common the belief that Abraham was the founder of what we call monotheism. So a lot of people look to the commonality of these different religions to Abraham as kind of a common ground of what all these faiths have in common in terms of monotheism. Of course, if we get into the details, we can argue that not all these religions are equal in their belief in one God. In fact, you could argue that Christianity, because of the Trinity, doesn't have pure monotheism, and Islam actually can argue that Judaism, because they have so many anthropomorphic ways of understanding God, is not as monotheistic as they are. So again, we could unite, we could divide, we could look for commonalities, we could look for differences. But what's interesting is the Gemara. I'll point it out to you. The Gemara says, in terms of Abraham and Sarah, it says that Avraham. It explains, Avram was, he became Abraham. What's the difference? Betchila nasa av Aram. In the beginning, he was a father of Aram. Aram is a region in the Middle East. Ulebesof nasa av l'chol ha'olam kula. At the end, Avraham, he became a father of the whole world. The father of the whole world is kind of echoing that sentiment that he inspires much of the world till today with his vision of one God. And the same thing with Sarai, Sarah. Sarai is the same. It's Sarah. She became Sarah. She was renamed, as was Abraham. But Chila Nasis Sarai Lumasa. Originally, she was a princess. She was like a queen of her people. Besof Nasis Sarah L'chol Ha'olam. Eventually, she became a like a queen to the entire world. She became the matriarch of the world. Again, in this sense, it's not just the Abrahamic religions, it's the Abrahamic and Sarah religions as well. So it's just interesting to note this idea is in the Gemara, and Maimonides picks up on this and other Gemaras, and in Hilchas Avodah Zarah, in the laws of idolatry, he has an extended conversation or learning about Abraham's role in rediscovering God, in which he explains that in earlier generation, he explains the progression of how polytheism or idolatry came into become so popular. And then he says, until this, I don't have Maimonides in front of me, but I studied it a number of times, this particular section, the beautiful section. So again, I just encourage everyone to look it up in the Laws of Avodah Zarah. It's the first few halachot there. And he says, once this one began to wonder about God, and he was always thinking and trying to understand, he I think he calls him Eitan, which means this one of strength. He basically reversed the course of polytheism and began to spread this idea of one God in the whole world. And Maimonides has a lot to say about it, which a lot of people say, wow, that's interesting that he all of a sudden inserts Abraham into the section about Avodah Zarah. Well, the answer is it's a mirror of the Gemara that we're learning here, which is Avraham, in Maimonides' mind, is the source of Abrahamic religions, is the source of the extended kind of monotheistic worldview that now permeates much of the world, is really due to Abraham, and we have to give Abraham the credit, and we have to refer back to him to show us how much of a difference one person can make, and in Maimonides' estimation, it's not simply history. It's of great value because Abraham was a philosopher, according to Maimonides, who contemplated the true nature of the world and came to this conclusion of monotheism, which means that each one of us shouldn't just accept that God exists as a belief, but we actually have a requirement to deeply delve into that till we understand that from a rational and philosophical level, as well as just a matter of faith. And that's why Maimonides rules that one is required not just to believe in God, but to know God. How do we know God today? Does science prove God or disprove God? I don't think it's simply one way or the other. I think that today we witness God in our kavana, in our intention and our action, which I think the Gemara Brachos is all about, and we're going to get to that. It's really about reciting the Shema, bringing God's unity into our consciousness with words, with heart, with intention, which is what Daf Yud Gimel talks about. That was number 3 of the top 10. Now we go to number 4, which is this idea of kavana. Let's take a look at the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, get that to Hayakore Batorah. If somebody was reading Torah, Ve'egia Zman HaMikra, and the time to read the Shema arrives, Im Kiven Libo, if he concentrated his heart. Now that's going to be a big discussion what we mean exactly. Yatza, he fulfills his obligation. Now the Mishnah continues, and we're going to talk about this in number 10, because that's where we're going to have more details, but I'll just read it quickly. B'prakim shol b'nei hakavod, when one is in between the sections of the blessings of the Shema and the Shema, you can ask about somebody who you honor. By the way, most people understand that today we don't do this anymore, meaning that you could ask of somebody who is a distinguished person. You can greet them. Umeshiv, and you could also respond to them. Uve'emsa shol b'nei hayira, and if you're in the middle of the Shema or its blessings, you're not in the in-between places, you can only ask about the well-being or offer greetings to somebody you're afraid of. Rashi learns you're afraid of somebody like your father or a great scholar. Actually, no, Rashi, learns that you're somebody you're afraid of that might kill you. You see Rashi here, I underlined it. Hayir Adam Shu Yare Mipanav, a person that you are fearful of, Shalo Yahargehu, that he shouldn't kill you. So obviously, this is somebody
a very powerful person, a warlord, a king. And if you don't say the right thing to him, he or she will have your head chopped off. So the commentaries, including Tosafot, says that's not a kiddush. That's a general principle. Anytime that there's a sakanas nefashos, with very few exceptions, you violate the mitzvot, and they learn nehayira is like your Rebbi muvak, like it's your main teacher or something like that. But again, that's a machlokas Rashi Tosafot and other commentaries as well. And there's going to be a debate. That's Omeshim, and you can respond to Rebbi Meir. That's Rebbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda is more lenient. Rabbi Yehuda Omer be'emsa shol b'mnei hayira u'meishiv b'mnei hakavod. When you are in the middle, you can respond. You can ask about the welfare of somebody who you are afraid of. Again, machlokas Rashi Tosafot of who that's referring to, and you could respond to somebody who is distinguished. With prakim, but if you're in the middle, meaning not in the middle, you're in between the sections. Shoel mipnei hakavod. You can ask from somebody. You can greet somebody who is just, not shoel doesn't really mean ask here. It just means greeting. You can wish them shalom. Somebody who's distinguished. Umeishiv shalom l'chol adam, and you could respond to anyone. What are these in between the sections mean? Between the first and the second blessing, between the second blessing and the Shema, between the Shema and the end of the first paragraph and the second paragraph of V'hayim Shema. Between V'hayim Shema and the third paragraph of Vayomer Bein Vayomer le'emes v'yatziv, between Vayomer and emes v'yatziv. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Bein Vayomer le'emes v'yatziv lo yasik. You can't interrupt between Vayomer and emes v'yatziv, which most of the commentaries explain that you could interrupt after you say v'yatziv, because the word emes is sometimes a Hashem Elokechem. Emes is a verse, although it's not the verse that we're quoting in Vayomer, in the third section. We say emes as, since there is a verse like that, there's a parallel verse like that ends with Hashem Elokechem emes. We say emes as part of the conclusion of Vayomer, and it also serves as the introduction to V'yatziv Nachon. So it's a word that's kind of like a link. It goes either before it and after it, and therefore you can't interrupt between, according to most commentaries, between Elokechem and emes, but after you say emes, you can interrupt, according to the majority of the commentaries. Okay, we're gonna go to Rashi and Tosafot now. Actually, we're gonna skip ahead to the Gemara and do the Gemara for a second. The Gemara says, Shema mina, we can deduce, we hear from what the Mishnah says, mitzvos strichos kavana, that one is required to have intentions when one does a mitzvah. Why is that a thing? Isn't that obvious? Don't you need kavana when you do a mitzvah? So the truth is, there is a debate that happens a number of times in the Gemara about whether or not mitzvos strichos kavana, do mitzvahs in fact need to have intention, or do they not need to have intention? In this top 10 teachings of the Talmud, we're going to discuss levels of intention. So, for example, at face value, the mitzvah strichos kavana is usually talking about the base level of kavana, not a Hasidic or Kabbalistic kavana, but just a base level of awareness that I am now doing a mitzvah. You don't have to verbally declare that, but you intentionally know what it is that you're doing is required by God at this time, and you do it with that, knowing that. You don't do it kind of like without realizing that or unaware, because that would be a mitzvah without kavana. So that's the base level of kavana that we're generally talking about. And do you need that or not? Or is it enough that you just do the thing? Right? do you fulfill the mitzvah of matzah even if you don't know that it's a mitzvah to eat matzah, even if you just happen to be at a seder and you just think it's food? I don't know, that it's a weird host. They serve these dry crackers. What type of dinner is that? But you eat it. Did you fulfill the mitzvah, or did you need to know that I am fulfilling a mitzvah of eating matzah before you eat the matzah? Or is it good enough to just know this is part of the Seder? I don't have to think about it specifically. As long as I know that I'm at a Seder and matzah is part of the Seder, that's enough. So that's already like part of the conversation. The same thing would be on a Rosh Hashanah. If you hear the shofar, you heard it, but you didn't think about, I am now going to, you happen to be walking and you heard the shofar. What if you stopped to hear it? The fact that you stopped means you're intending to listen, because you stopped doing whatever your normal walking and you stopped to better hear it. So that means you wanted to hear it. But do you have to say, it's Rosh Hashanah, I want to hear that shofar as my mitzvah of Rosh Hashanah? Or is it enough the fact that you stopped that reveals that that's kind of your intention, even if you didn't specifically tell yourself, I want to hear it because it's Rosh Hashanah? What if you didn't stop, but you did hear it? Is that you didn't have kavana, you heard something without really thinking about what it is you're hearing. You didn't stop, you didn't make a special effort to hear it, but you did hear it physically. If somebody said, did you hear that? You'd say, yeah, I heard it. They say, what was it? I was like, I don't know. I wasn't paying attention. I mean, whatever. Oh, maybe the person will remember after the fact that it's Rosh Hashanah, but it's not what he was thinking about when he actually heard the shofar blowing. He probably wasn't thinking anything at all. He continued doing whatever he was doing. So those are kind of some of the arguments in general in other areas about kavana, and a lot of rabbis will give many hours of shiurim on the differences between Pesach and shofar and Megillah and krias Shema, because they each seem to have some elements that are different from the other elements in this conversation of what kavana is. Many rabbis have a consensus that mitzvah shrichas kavana, the ruling is that they do need kavana, at least lichatchila, which means we prefer that they have kavana. If they did not have kavana, that you would be yotze. Some people make a distinction that mitzvahs need kavana if it's a d'oraisa, if it's a biblical mitzvah, but they don't need kavana if it's a rabbinic mitzvah. Other people make a distinction that it depends on the particular mitzvah. Certain mitzvahs, the kavana is inherent to what the mitzvah is. So, for example, Shema and tefillah might be different than, let's say, matzah or other mitzvah, because if you didn't know that you're reciting the Shema, you didn't know even maybe what the Shema is about in a general sense, at least the beginning, what is it that you did? You mumbled a few words. So perhaps there could be a reason why, even if mitzvahs do not need kavana in general, they might need kavana here. Or you could argue that even though the Gemara seems to say here that mitzvahs don't need kavana, it doesn't really say that they don't need kavana. It's bringing down that according to that opinion, meaning at face value, our Mishnah doesn't seem to go with that opinion, but that would be problematic. So there's a kind of far-fetched squishing of the meaning of the words of the Mishnah to try to allow the Mishnah to be able to fit in with that, which is what? Which is the following. I'll read that again because I didn't get to the punchline here. Ma'akiv and Libo Likros. What does it mean if he intended to read it? Likros, to read. V'hakakari. What do you mean if he intended to read it? That's exactly what is going on. The person, Carlebach, the person's reading Torah, right? Let's say the person's reading he's reading the section of the Torah that has the Shema in it, the first paragraph of the Shema. That's what he's doing. So what do you mean he intends to read it? He is reading it. So the Gemara answers, Bikare lahagia, that the person who's reading the Torah in the case of the Mishnah is a scribe, And he's reading the Torah not with the intention of reading it, but correcting it, because the scribe has to look at every letter and every word, obviously, but every letter to see if it's written correctly. If there's any extra letters, if the letters are if it's spelled correctly, and so on and so forth. Here we have Rashi and Tosafot. Let's see what Rashi says. Shema min ha-mitzvos shvichas kavana, sheyehi miskaben l'shem mitzvos. It seems that our Mishnah indicates that you have to intend for the sake of doing a mitzvah. V'tiksha l'rabba, that's problematic to the sage Rabba. The Avraham Masechtas Rosh Hashanah Daf Chav Ches, because he says in the Gemara Rosh Hashanah, Hatoker l'shir yatsa, that if somebody is playing around with the shofar and is playing it as a musical instrument, but happens to hit the right notes, then we would say that even though he didn't intend to do the mitzvah of shofar, he just thought he was playing music, he would fulfill his obligation, because the mitzvah is einot tzrichas kavana. So, kivan likros, next Rashi, as long as the person, this is the Gemara is explaining, as long as the person intended to read it, but we don't find that he needs to have the intention for the reading it for a mitzvah. He's still only intending just to read the Torah. The Gemara says hakakari, but he's already reading it, so how would that fit in? Habikari ka'asik Tana. The Tana is referring to somebody reading the Torah. Yeah. Okay, so the Gemara answers Bikar lahagia es hasefer. He's reading it to correct the Torah. And yesh batot, to see if there's a mistake. He's not even intending for the sake of a regular reading. So according to what we're saying now, we'd say there's 3 levels of reading that Rashi is referring to here. One is reading it without even wanting to read it. He's simply a scribe. He's reading it only with the intention of finding mistakes. So it's not a normal reading. The second level is somebody reading it to read. And the third level is somebody reading it with the intention to fulfill a particular mitzvah of reading the krias Shema. So, according to Rashi, even Rabbah, who says mitzvahs einot tzrichas kavana, that mitzvahs don't need to have intention, it doesn't mean per se that the person has zero intention. It means they don't need the intention that I am doing a mitzvah. The person has to, but if it's something if the mitzvah that they're doing is to read the Shema, they have to read the Shema. They can't be a scribe making a correction. That's not even called reading. So that's how Rashi would learn. Tosafot actually doesn't agree with Rashi. Let's look at Tosafot. Tosafot says the following. B'kar lahagia, he brings down Rashi, but he doesn't like that. He says, Tema akati kakari. The fact is, even a scribe who's reading it to make corrections is still reading. So reading is reading, whatever the reason is you're reading it for. It's still a form of reading. Okay, then therefore he says, Nir kakar lahagia she'enukar hatevis kilchasan. Therefore Tosafot argues on Rashi. He says, when the scribe is reading it, he reads it differently. He doesn't read it properly, like the halacha dictates of what the word actually says. Kudasan. Ella b'chsivasan. He's not reading it with the way the vowels say they should be vocalized. Rather, he's just reading it the way it's written. Kari k'dei lahavin b'chaseros v'yaseros. Just to check to see if there's certain words that are spelled with either with vubs or without vubs. So because the vubs are like a vowel that can be there or cannot be there depending on what the Masorah, the tradition is, or the Mikra. So Kimola Totafos Umazuzos. So Totafos mezuzos, right? It doesn't. The Tosafot is a chaser. Mezuzos is a male, right? The Tosafot doesn't have a vav. The mezuzah does, but he's letat fot, right? Or mezuzot. Ve'im kiven libo alav dafke leklamar likros kedin kenikudotan kilchatan. Here, what it means if he intends, it doesn't mean whether he actually intends to read. It just means whether he kiven libo. Tosafot is interpreting to mean, is he careful in the reading to read it halachically properly? So that again means that Tosafot wants to learn that even if you're reading it to correct it, but if that reading to correct it is reading it properly, that would still fulfill your obligation. The only way that you wouldn't fulfill your obligation is when you're reading it to correct it and you're reading it improperly. You're not reading it the way you're supposed to read it. Which is Tosafot understands his shot is semi-problematic because that doesn't use the kiven libo doesn't. He's saying it's a kiven. The word kiven libo doesn't fit in so well that he's acknowledging that. Okay, so we're getting up to, that was number 4. We're getting up to number 5. I see Shelley asked a question: if a person does a good deed, like helping a sick person, does the intention matter? The answer is, on a certain level, no, it doesn't. Of course, good intention helps because it adds enthusiasm to the action that you're doing. So, for example, if you give, I think Maimonides and others say, it's a Gemara actually, if you give something to someone and you have a sour face, a bad attitude about it, you actually don't necessarily get the mitzvah because you kind of ruined it by your demeanor. If you're mean when you help somebody, there's some people who like to do tzedakah, but they also like to be mean about it. Well, that's a problem. So the answer to your question is your lack of intention impairing the kind of process of doing something good or not? Let's say if you're a doctor and you're doing an operation and you don't really care and love the patient, but you just want to do the best job, I would say you did it. You removed the tumor, you did the operation, the person's alive, and that's okay. But if what you're doing is conveyed to the patient, to the person who's sick, that you're going to do everything it takes to do the right thing, but you don't care about them, if they know that and they feel that, that means there may be something missing from the therapeutic process. So the answer, Shelley, is it depends. I don't know if that's good enough, but that's basically meaning sometimes give the dollar to the person as long as you didn't, say, you don't deserve this, but I'll give it to you anyway. If you say that, it takes away from the mitzvah because it makes the person feel bad. So if your lack of feelings are conveyed in a way that makes the person feel bad about themselves, so then your lack of intention actually harms the mitzvah of the goodness that you're doing. If, on the other hand, you lack intention, you lack the heart, but you do the right thing begrudgingly, but only you know your begrudging feelings, you don't let the other people know that, then you did the mitzvah. You still did the mitzvah. You might have missed out on. Everybody agrees that the best way to do a mitzvah is with kavana. The question only is whether you still fulfill the obligation without the kavana, and you would have fulfilled your obligation because you still fed the hungry and they now have food, or you healed the sick and they're now well. You return them back to their former health in that area. But let's go on to number 5, about how Tosafot decides the halacha. And in this case, it is in the case of Rebbi versus the rabbis. What are we talking about? There's a debate between Rebbi and the rabbis. Let's look at it very quickly. So it says, krias Shema kichtava divrei Rebbi. When you read the Shema, you have to say it the way it's written. The chachamim omrim b'chol lashon. The rabbis say you could say the Shema in any language. you're English, you could read just if you don't know Hebrew, just read the Shema in English out of the Art Scroll, whatever sitter the Birnbaum, whatever sitter you use. My time at the Rebbi, Amakra, V'hayu b'havayatan yehei. Rebbi deducts this from the word V'hayu. It should be, the way it is. Rabbanan, my time, Ahu. What's the reason of the sages? Amakra, Shema. They say the verse itself, Shema. Here, B'chol Hashem means any language Shema that you can listen or hear in. Okay, so the Tosafot says the following. B'chachamim omrim b'chol lashon. The sages say you can say the Shema in any language. So the question is, today in the synagogue, I'm giving a class on prayer, which I'm not right now, but I guess I am maybe at the moment. I'm giving a shiur on the Gemara. So I want to have something practical. If you don't speak Hebrew and you don't understand the Shema in Hebrew, you can say it in English. That's at least the way the rabbis rule. What about Rebbi? What about the Rebbi? How should we be concerned about the ruling of Rebbi? Should we teach everyone to recite the Shema in Hebrew and refrain from saying it in English? Tosafot says you don't need to do that. Although it's a nice thing, the Tosafot agrees with the sages. The question is why? Now, he said, what do you mean, why? Don't we normally rule according to the majority? Rebbe is one rabbi, the sages are majority. That's a good question, and that's why I'm going to take you deeper into Tosafos. So, Omer Hari, one of the Balei Tosafos, says the following: the halacha kechachamim. The law is like the sages, so therefore go ahead and read the Shema in any language that you understand. Why is that? The halacha Rebbi mechaveiro v'lo mechaveirav. Now it's quoting a Gemara in Eruvin on the 46b of Eruvin, in case you want to look it up, which says the following: there's certain rabbis that when they argue with other rabbis, there's a kind of a formula of knowing who wins. So for this is Rabbi Yacov and Rabbi Zera. They say that, for example, the halacha is like the opinion of Rabbi Akiva when he disputes any other individual sage. The law now, Rabbi Yossi has a greater status than even Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Yossi says the rabbis in the Eruvin say that when Rabbi Yossi argues even with the other sages, plural, meaning when he is in the minority, we still follow him. That's a pretty, in other words, the principle of Acher Rabim Lahatos, that we follow the majority rules, does not apply to all rabbis. So, for example, if you have, this Rabbi Herschel Schachter and Rabbi Moshe Tendler and Rabbi Marlowe, the former Olav Shalom of blessed memory from Crown Heights, they rule one way, and Moshe Feinstein rules the other way. So you have 3 against 1, and everybody else is kind of quiet. Those are, everyone else is waiting to say, no, what do you do? Do you follow the 3 or do you follow the 1? So the answer would be, not in all cases, but because Reb Moshe Feinstein's status is the status of a Gadol Hadar, he's the greatest of the generation in terms of halacha. Now, doesn't mean we always all follow Reb Moshe Feinstein all the time, and we'll talk about that later. But because in general he has this tremendous authority, many people would rule that we follow Reb Moshe
over those other rabbis. So Rabbi Yossi in the Talmud is said to be on such a great level that even when his contemporaries disagreed with him, we regarded his ruling as authoritative and as the halacha. Now let's talk about Rabbi Yehuda, who our Gemara and the Tosas is focused on right now. And it's relevant, I'm telling you the background for this because it is relevant to some degree. Rabbi Yehuda, and we're referring to Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, the author of the Mishnah, or the compiler of the Mishnah, I should say. Now, the Gemara says when he argues against an individual sage, the law is like him. However, I have to warn you that, in other words, the implication, the diuk, is mechaveirov v'lo mechaveirav. The Gemara indicates that specifically when he's arguing against another rabbi singular, but when he's arguing against his contemporaries, rabbis, plural, then we go back to the principle of following the majority, and we do not listen to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. Now, however, there is a Gemara in Baba Basra, Daf Kuf Chaf Daled Amid Beis, that seems to indicate that velo machaveirav, that there could be a case that when Rebbi argues with his contemporaries, plural, he argues on the rabbis, a group of rabbis, that it's not so clear that the halacha is like his contemporaries. We are inclined to go like Rebbi. It's not necessarily clear that we go like Rebbi, but we prefer to go, meaning we look at the case and we see whether there's a way of making Rebbi be deemed as the halachic master. Now, some people in the Gemara and Eruvin say that Gemara, that case that it's talking about there, is an exception to the rule, but generally we say, like the Gemara, the Gemara in Baba Kama is the exception, and the Gemara in Eruvin is the rule, which is you listen to the sages over Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. But again, you don't necessarily have to understand it like that. So Tosfos would obviously say, like that opinion that says that Baba Kama is an exception, but generally speaking, we follow the sages over Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi as the Tosfos rules here, which is why we can read the Shema in any language, because we follow the sages over Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. Again, that's just like to show you that when the Gemara says a principle about how we rule, there's often another Gemara that has a little less clarity on that principle, so to speak. I'm just showing you that. And yet Tosfos still will say that Gemara in Baba Kama is the exception, the Gemara in Eruvin is the rule, and we'll actually apply that in halacha and make that the ruling here in Brachot as well. So I'm just giving you a little tidbit of how halacha is decided. Another reason why you might be able to say that rule is not a hard and fast rule is also based on the Gemara in Eruvin and Baba Kama, which says that when we make these kind of greater predictions, there are three opinions about the status of these predictions. One is that it simply means that is the halacha, meaning we make these kind of pronouncements and that's what we follow. The second one is that we are inclined to follow, but we don't necessarily make those rulings in public. We could talk about it at a later time. What does that mean? If that's the law, why not announce it in public? And the third way of understanding is as it appears, meaning it's not an established fact all the time, but like we will go in that direction, so to speak. So again, a lot of pronouncements in the Talmud have counter pronouncements, and therefore, whenever you see the words in the Talmud, the halacha is like this one, don't follow that necessarily, because it's like basically it's like, imagine today if you say Rabbi Elyashiv ruled this way, ruled the halacha is like this. Now, that's great if you are a follower of Rabbi Elyashiv, but if you're a follower of Rav Moshe Feinstein, so, just because you heard the halacha in the name of one rabbi doesn't mean that that's the authority of all authorities. So again, even in the time of the Talmud, when certain rabbis said, the halacha is like this, rabbi, that doesn't mean that that's how the other rabbis agreed with him. That was his ruling. It's not everyone's ruling. So I have to say, part of studying Talmud is about it is a journey. It's not about the destination, because if you're trying to find out the halacha, the Gemara is not the best way to get to it. Although, as a rabbi, you can't just cut out the Gemara and just go to the halachic authorities, because if you do, you're missing something. You sometimes don't have the best. As a rabbi, you're supposed to do more than just read the Shulchan Aruch or the Shilos and Shuvos. You need to do that, and you need to do the Gemara. One without the other isn't enough. But I just warn you, I know it sounds like terrible, but I'm going to just tell you, anyone who's a serious student of Talmud should know that we don't rule based on the Talmud. That doesn't mean that we don't rule based on the Talmud as well. We base our rulings in part on the Talmud, but it's very hard to extract a ruling from the Talmud alone. Occasionally, an exception to that rule is somebody like Rav Moshe Feinstein. I've seen other rabbis also occasionally go back to a Gemara and reassess a halacha based on the Gemara, but that's not the primary way we rule. There are many other factors in ruling, such as the customs of what we've been doing for the nearly the 1700 years since the time of the Gemara, or 1600 years. There's been many different practices. You don't read a page of Gemara and say, okay, let's go and do this. You then look in the Shulchan Aruch, and then you look, and the Shulchan Aruch is written over 400 years ago, so you don't even follow the Shulchan Aruch in many areas now. You follow the rulings of the more recent poskim, the more recent halachic authorities. So that's just a little bit about being clear and honest about how the halacha isn't settled by the time of the Gemara, and it isn't even settled by the time of the Shulchan Aruch, and it isn't even settled now, because there are many new contemporary questions that are coming up as we speak right now, and the halacha is still alive and well, and we'll deal with those new issues. The doors are not closed. Okay, let's go on to number 6. Number 6 is, if the heart is in the right place, is that good enough? Or do I need the correct action to go along with the feeling? Now, we know that in halacha, if the mitzvah is to put on tefillin, even though there are certain kavanot, there's certain thoughts that we should have when we put on tefillin, such as that we're binding our heart and our mind to God. We're accepting Him as our master. We're in His service. We're binding the ideas of the Exodus onto our minds and our hearts, which means that, as it says in Tanya and in the Zohar, and it's brought down the Shulchan Aruch actually, that one has to have the intentions that just like God took us out of a nation of Egypt that was impossible to escape from, He was able to allow us to be freed from there. So too today, we can go out of our own evil inclination that threatens to ensnare us in its boundaries and its difficulties. God can give us the strength to overcome the hardships that are imposed upon us by our own Yetzer Hara. So even though those are intentions one should have when one puts on tefillin, imagine somebody meditates on those intentions for a full hour, but doesn't actually put on tefillin. They do not fulfill the mitzvah of tefillin, because tefillin requires that one put on the tefillin, not just contemplate the ideas behind the tefillin. So the question then becomes, when one intends the idea of the Shema, right? Shema Yisroel Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Right? Hear or listen, Israel, God is our God, God is one. if I think about this, and I think about the kavana, maybe I go even deeper. The Gemara describes the echad, the dalid. When I say the dalid, I have to think about God in the four directions, and the ches, people also described as the seven heavens and earth. So let's say I say that I say this in my mind without actually reading it. I think it. Did I do the mitzvah of the Shema? And let's see what the Gemara says about that. And also the other question would be if I say the Shema without thinking about what the meaning is, do I fulfill my obligation? So this is a lot about the conversation that's being had on Daf Yud Gimel. So first, I'll just read it from here. Tana Rabbanan. V'hayu shelo yikar alim afreya. The word v'hayu means not to read it backwards. In other words, don't start with the last verse and then so on. Hadvarim alav avecha. These words upon your heart. Yachol tehei kol aparasha tzricha kavana. I might think that the whole entire first paragraph of the Shema requires intention. And I'm going to say that here kavana means what the words, the pirush hamilos, what the words mean. Talmud Lomar, which is a question of why all of a sudden do you need to know the words, since there's a whole conversation we just had about mitzvah shrichus kavana or not. Why do I need to have that kavana? But we'll talk about this in the next teaching. Talmud Lomar ha'ela, ad kan shrichus kavana. Because the verse says ha'ela, these words. Let me show you what I'm talking about. I'm going to look at the Art Scroll Siddur. The verse says, "You shall love Hashem your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your resources." That's not the meaning of it. That's a rabbinic commentary. With all your might. Let these matters that I command you today be upon your heart. Teach them thoroughly to your children and speak of them while you sit in your home, or while you walk on your way, and you retire when you retire, when you arise. So here it says, let these matters that I command you today be upon your heart. So basically the Gemara is saying until that statement you need to have kavana, meaning I have to know what I'm saying. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, and let these matters that I command you today be upon your heart. I have to know that I'm saying that, because what am I saying? I'm saying that I'm in a relationship that I have to love God. If I don't know that I'm saying that, but until there, it needs to be aware of what it is saying. After that, you don't need to. Now, on the other hand, that's one rabbi. Amalek Rebbi Kiva, that's Divrei Rebbi Elazar. That's Rebbi Eliezer. Amalek Rebbi Kiva, Hari Omer, Asher Anochi Mitzavcha Hayom, Al Levavecha. Mikan Atalamad Shekol Parsha Kula Tzricha Kavana. It says that I'm commanding you today. Rabbi Akiva comes to a different conclusion, that the first entire portion, meaning what I'm commanding you today is a reference not just to what I commanded you in the past tense, but in the present tense, and maybe even what's coming up. So the Gemara says, it quotes Rabbi Bar Chana and says, Halacha Rabbi Akiva, the law follows Rabbi Akiva. But other rabbis don't agree with Rabbi Akiva, and just because it says the law follows Rabbi Akiva, other rabbis say we do not accept that ruling. Rabbi Yehuda says, I'm just skipping a little bit, Kivin shekivin libo perak rishon shuven etzarech. As long as you had the intentions for the first chapter, you don't need any more intentions. And okay, what do I want to read here? Marzutra says that Mikan ve'ech mitzvahs kriya, that the first section, Alav Avecha, kind of like what we said earlier, until you say upon my heart, that needs to have intention. Afterwards, you just have to read it. Rabbi Yoshia says, Ad kan mitzvahs kriya, Mikan ve'ech mitzvahs kavana. Until there, you have to read.
Further than that, you just have to intend. Why is it, according to the first opinion, that after Alavecha it's just reading it? Because it says to speak in them, meaning speech alone is good enough. But it also says v'dibartabam in the. So let me see how this works here. So we said Mar Zutra said that you need kavana in the beginning, and then you need to just read it. So the Gemara at this point thinks that we're talking about the first parsha doesn't need to be read at all. It just needs to be thought in your mind. And the Gemara questions that. Why would that be? Because it says l'daber bam, right? It says only in the second paragraph of Hayim Shema to speak in them. But that can't be the case, because in the first section it also says v'dibarta bam, you should speak in them. So the Gemara reconciles that no, we didn't understand it correctly. Adkan in the first chapter, Mrs. Kavana ukriya, we have to add in an extra word. It's an intention with reading. But afterwards, kriya below kavana, it could be read without intention. Okay. Now the Gemara will say, why not? Why don't I need intention for the second paragraph? And the Gemara analyzes it and says that that even though it says that it should be upon your heart in the second section, so I might think I need to have intentions for the second section, but that is not so much to tell us the mitzvah of kavana in the second section, but is coming to tell us where the tefillin has to be, because it has to be put on, placed upon your heart, meaning we learn the concept of putting the tefillin on your left hand near your heart, unless you're a lefty. But otherwise, you put it in a way that it faces your heart. You move the tefillin, you position the hand tefillin in a way that it faces your heart. Okay, but just to address this question about doing the Shema without the kavana, and the answer is that a mitzvah by its very here what's interesting is there's at least two mitzvot being done when you say the Shema. There's actually a number of mitzvot, and I'm going to get to that in how when you actually say the Shema and its blessings, you could be fulfilling maybe 5 or 6 mitzvot. But I'm not going to tell you how right now, because that's for a later time. I'll just say off the bat that there's a mitzvah of Ahavas Hashem, right? There's a mitzvah of loving God, and there's a mitzvah of Yichud Hashem, of God's unity. There's also a mitzvah of not having more than one God. There's also a mitzvah of Yiras Hashem, of awe of God. There's also a mitzvah of remembering the Exodus. So that's already 5 mitzvot, right? So if you say the Shema, and it's not just a recitation of a formula, but you're paying attention to what it means, and you're having a relationship with God that includes loving God. So, for example, if I'm grateful for my life and for the blessings I have in my life, and I say, where do all those blessings come from? Don't they come from God? I mean, that's not even a very deep thing. I mean, it's beautiful to have those intentions. And many of us, most of the time, don't even really have that intention when we say the Shema. But if I do have that intention, if you have that intention, when you say the Shema, and you say, God, I'm so grateful, I'm so happy for my life, I'm so happy for the gifts of my life, and I know they all come from you, and I love you. So, the blessings that come before the Shema are there for us to kind of be aware that God gave us the gifts of the world, the gift of Torah. And if I say that and I have some level of relationship with God, and when I say that I love you, God, with all my heart, with all my soul, with all my being, right? And I mean that in any way, so then I'm fulfilling the mitzvah of love. Perhaps if I also become aware of the awe of God, I'm fulfilling that I want to listen to God and not disobey Him.
and because I want to respect him and I'm in awe of him, I'm fulfilling the mitzvah of Yirat Hashem. And then if I unify God, when I say the Shema, I know I'm out of order here. When I say God is one in the whole world, and I think about that oneness, that no matter how many things there are, they all are created by God, and in no way do they take away from God's ultimate power over everything. So then I'm unifying God in both the positive and the negative, that I believe in one God and I don't believe in many gods. So 4 mitzvot just there, before I even get to mentioning the Exodus or any other mitzvot. Okay, great. Why do I need to read it? Aren't all those mitzvot of the heart? And the answer is yes. On some level, they are mitzvot of the heart. And therefore, any time I have those thoughts, it doesn't have to be related to the Shema. They're called, a lot of people refer to them as mitzvot tamidiyot. They're constant mitzvot. But the truth is, a constant mitzvah there's a problem with the constant mitzvah. Because guess what that means? All the time could mean no time. You know what I mean? Meaning, when I have to do a mitzvah all of the time, I can't really be doing something all the time. So it means it's a belief I have in me, but what does that really mean? If I don't work on that belief just becomes something that I occasionally, when I'm asked the question, do I believe in one God? The answer is yes. But do I think deeply about it? Do I have a relationship? Can I say I love God? No, I can't say I love God unless I actually work on that. So therefore, the loving God is not really a mitzvah tamidiyot. I'll prove it to you. There's another mitzvah, avot tidbak, you should cleave to God. The rabbi said you can't cleave to God because God is too intense. He's like a fire. Therefore, you have to cleave to the Torah scholars. Okay, that's a whole other conversation between the Baal Shem Tov and the Vilna Gaon about what that really means. The Baal Shem Tov wanted to kind of take away that rabbinic interpretation of needing, paradoxically, the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement that eventually gave such prominence to looking up and worshiping, not worshiping, but venerating the Rebbi to such an extent, was the person who taught that you don't need a rabbi, the great sages, to cleave to God. You need to cleave to God on your own. Okay, I'm getting a little bit too far offshore. This is for another time. But let's just say, therefore, why do I need to say the Shema? And the answer is because there's 2 parts here of the mitzvah. One is there's a mitzvah to recite the Shema. Now, the rabbis know that part of the mitzvah of the Shema is the Kabbalat Olmach Shemayim, is uniting, are the Ava and the Yira and another thing that they don't call a mitzvah of the 613, but is so big that it's bigger than any one mitzvah, which is accepting the yoke of heaven, that God is my God. So it contains all of these mitzvot in it, but it still needs and requires that I recite it as its own mitzvah that contains the other mitzvot in it. So the answer is, mitzvot are sometimes complicated. It's not I'm doing one mitzvah and not the other. I'm doing multiple mitzvot at the same time. And I'm doing the mitzvah of reciting the Shema in the morning and the evening, or the evening and the morning. So the answer is, when you have these intentions without saying the Shema, you do fulfill your obligation of loving God. You do fulfill your obligation of uniting God, but you don't fulfill your obligation of saying the Shema in the morning and the evening. There's a mitzvah to not just feel it and believe it, but also to recite it. Unfortunately for us, a lot of people who recite it without any emotional relationship to God or even thoughts of faith in God may be fulfilling technically the mitzvah of the Shema, at least if they knew what they were saying or knew they were reading the Shema, at least the first line. That's how most authorities poskin that you have to at least intend, the Rambam, to recite the first line, Shema Yisroel, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, knowing what you're saying. And then we don't, these other rulings are not necessarily the halacha. We should try, we should endeavor to do them. But we may not be fulfilling our obligation to love God. Even if we say it and know that it says you should love God, does that mean I love God? If I say I love somebody but I don't actually love them, by saying it, does it mean I love them? No. So the answer is that there are different elements of the mitzvah. You could fulfill one through speech without true feelings. You could fulfill the other one with feelings without the speech, but you need both. It's like being in a relationship would require you to do both things. You couldn't just tell the person you love them but really hate them. You couldn't just feel that you love the person but never tell them. You would need to do both to be in a good relationship. And that is the same thing with the Shema and the mitzvahs of the love of God and the oneness of God and so on. Okay, that was number... Now I have to go, but I have to finish the top 10. So let's get this done. This is number 7. You know what? Number 7 is until where do you need kavana in the Shema? I covered that in number 6, so I did 6 and 7 together. Number 8 is the reading of the Shema of Rebbi. And the Gemara basically says that Rebbi would only recite the first paragraph of, not even the first paragraph, just the first line. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Obviously, he would say God's name properly. And the one rabbi said to the other, when does Rebbi say the Shema? I don't ever hear him stop to say the Shema. And the other rabbi responded, when he covers his eyes, he's saying the Shema. So there's a whole conversation. We learn out from there that we're required to recite the Shema with our eyes covered, the first line of the Shema. Most people say that's just simply that we have more kavana. Okay. What about Baruch Shem? Some authorities held that even though it doesn't say it in the Gemara, Rebbe would whisper Baruch Shem as well. What about the other parts of the Shema and its blessings? There was a debate about that, whether he would do them later on or not. And what he did do is he always mentioned something about the exodus from Egypt in his shir. Now, just to know, why did Rebbe not daven like everyone else, a full davening in its time? Because he was osek b'mitzvah. He was one of the greatest scholars of all time, and therefore what he would do. What Rebbe would do is he would always mention the Exodus during his speech, and the question is why? If he's going to finish anyway, I mean, if he's going to do the whole Shema and before and after and all that stuff later, why would he make sure? No, I was just saying. So he was teaching Torah because he was teaching, and he started so early in the morning. That's what Rashi says. It was before it was time. It was before it was so dark that you couldn't say the Shema yet. You weren't allowed to say the Shema yet. So that's why he would just say the Shema, and then either he would say all the blessings later, or he wouldn't, depending on which rabbi you listen to. Again, we would say that the halacha you have to recite if for some reason you are osek b'mitzvah, but the time passes. But it's still during the day, you would still say the Shema afterwards. There's different opinions about, in terms of the blessings of the Shema. We learned about that earlier. How many hours more you have? Do you have till midday? Do you have just till Zman Tefillah, or do you have the whole entire day to say the blessings of the Shema? I go with the ruling that says you have the whole entire day. Okay, that's number 8. Let's go to number 9. Number 9 is clarifying the Mishnah and responding during and in between the middle of the Shema. Basically, the Gemara says, I don't have time to do that now, but it explains, there's a Havamin and a Maskana about what exactly it means when it says Umeshiv and he responds, and the Gemara explains that. Number 10 is very practical. It's the halachic application of when to answer kadish and kedusha when you're reading the Shema. It's in Tosafot, and basically Tosafot rules that we rule like Rabbi Yehuda, because it's Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda. Remember that Gemara in Eruvin that's talking about different rabbis. I said it's somewhat practical. The Gemara there also talks about different rabbis that dispute one another, including Rabbi Yehuda against Rabbi Meir. We follow Rabbi Yehuda. So who do we follow here? In that we would respond to somebody who's a dignified person, even bein haprakim, even be'emsa, even in the middle of saying the Shema. So even though in practical terms we don't really do that in Shul today, because we don't really follow this Gemara in Shul for the most part. However, we do follow it in one area, which is when the chazan gets up to kedusha or kadish, we do interrupt sections of the Shema to answer kedusha and to answer certain amens in the kadish as well. That's what Tosafot says, and there's more on that. Look in the back of the siddur for additional explanations of when and how to interrupt. For example, we don't interrupt for yimloch, that's an addition. We don't interrupt for certain amens in the Kaddish, but we interrupt for other amens. Okay, thank you for listening.